Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to be doing the brushless DIY crazy cart build. Let's get to disassembling the cart here. And the first thing you want to do is take apart your plastics. This has been documented a million times on crazy carts. If you've never taken apart a crazy cart, or you've never seen a video on how to take apart a crazy cart, we're going to briefly cover it here. We're not going to go super in depth. You're going to take that plastic off. It's held in there with some Phillips head screws. You want to take both sides of that stuff off. Once you have that removed, you can see your motor, your chain guard, your tensioner, your battery, and controller. Now we can start to remove the battery. That's the second step that you're going to want to do. And that's just held in there with a Allen key and a wing nut. So the first thing is to remove that Allen key. Once that Allen key is removed, you can then unthread that wing nut and then slide the bracket off of the batteries. Pretty good system that they got here for the stock setup, but we're going to be running a 48 volt battery, so this won't fit anymore. So you can get that out of the way, pull the batteries out to the right side of the frame, and you'll see the entire wiring harness. And this is where you're going to want to start disconnecting everything. We're not going to be using the stock controller anymore, so you're not going to need any of these wires. And some of them have little press tabs and locking pins, so you're going to need to press those locking pins while you disconnect the wires. Some of them will require like a little pick to actually get in there and unlock the clip. So don't just rip them apart and break the wires. That way you can reuse this stuff on a secondary cart or a third cart, whatever you got, backup parts, It's always good to keep this stuff in good shape. That way your buddy blows up his cart, you can give him a motor or a controller. But so now that I got all the all the harness wires removed, you can then remove the controller, and that's just held in there with two Phillips head screws. Or actually, these are Allen head screws. These are Allen keys, whatever you want to call them. Hex screws, is that the proper name for them? I don't know. There's two that hold the controller in. And then once you get those out, you're going to want to come up to the top of the forks here and just snip all of the zip ties that are holding the motor wire in its routing place. And so with all those zip ties removed, there's actually one more that's on the harness that you're going to want to snip. Once you snip all those zip ties, you're going to want to de-pin your motor wire. So there's two small little locking pins on the metal parts of the wire. Just press those in with a metal pick or a screwdriver or an Allen key, and then you can actually pull the motor wires out. Once you pull the motor wires out of the plug, you're going to then want to come up to the top of the motor and unscrew the four hex screws holding the motor in. And once you have the four screws removed, your motor will be freed from the frame. And as long as you have the motor wires depinned, you can slide the motor wire straight through the frame here. And it makes your life super easy to pull out. That's what she said. And yeah, so now you got your stock motor out. The last thing you're going to want to do is just take your charging port and your switch out, because we're no longer going to be needing those. It comes with its own switch, and you're going to be using a different charger for your battery anyway. The next step in disassembling this cart is taking off your chain guard, and that's held in there with two Phillips head screws and one Allen key. You can use a super long screwdriver like this just to get easy access to those Phillips head screws. Pop that guy off, and then what that allows you to do is take your wheel off and your hub. So you can just flip your cart over on its side, usually the easiest thing to do. That way you can get access to those two bolts. You then want to take this center wheel off. And the reason we're doing that is because we're going to need to put a new chain on this now that we have a new motor and a new sprocket set up on the top. You'll need a couple extra links to make sure that it's not too tight. So go ahead, remove this bottom wheel. If you've never removed the bottom wheel, there's a couple videos out there on YouTube that fully detail how to put the spacers back together. Really not that hard. If you're installing a brushless motor, you can definitely take apart this wheel here. So yep, I got my wheel out, got the chain out, and now we're ready to move on to prepping the new electronics. So for the Flipsky 75100, I'm using XT90s and banana plugs. So the XT90 is for the battery, and the banana plugs are for the phase wires to the motor. So you want to solder that XT90 on there, and then you're going to want to solder these banana plugs to the phase wires. Once you solder the banana plugs to the phase wires, it's a good idea to heat shrink those, or heat shrink, right? Is that what it's called? I forget. Yeah, heat shrink. Yeah, you don't want to heat shrink those. That way they don't short. So here's the fun part. If you are making your own motor mount, you're going to need to anneal the piece of aluminum. That way it doesn't crack. So you'll have to heat it up with a blowtorch. You're going to want to pre-cut it to the exact dimensions. I'll have all the dimensions for cutting your motor mount in the description below. That way you can just look at the dimensions and cut it to the exact spec. You're going to need a sledgehammer. You're going to need a vise. You're going to need a piece of wood, a hole saw, and a drill. If you want to avoid all of these time-consuming and tedious tasks, you can just purchase the prefab motor mount from Charged Up 3D. I believe it's $50. It's only $25 more than the piece of aluminum that you purchase on Amazon. And it comes with everything pre-cut and ready to go. Saves you a hell of a lot of time, and it's a perfect 90-degree bend, so you don't have to spend your time zeroing out that 90-degree bend. If you have a welder, theoretically, you could just weld 2 plates of aluminum together. Might be a lot easier. Probably not as easy as just purchasing that prefab mount. So, as you see here, in the middle of me making this mount, the mail actually got delivered, and I got my pre-made mount. So I said, screw this. I'm just going to go with the pre-made mount because you see everything, it just lines up so perfectly. I don't have to drill out the center hole for my motor. I don't have to break out the calipers. So for the sake of time, I went with the prefabbed mount. Comes with all your mounting hardware. Makes your life super easy. So you can see you got all the top mounting screws, the motor mounting screws, the nylon locking washers, and it also comes with an Allen key for you to install those. So before you throw the motor onto the cart, you're just going to want to make sure your motor wires are coming out the direction you want. So in this case, we're going to have the motor wires coming out towards the rider, so they're going to be facing us. And then you're going to want to Loctite all of your motor screws. So you want to use some blue Loctite. There's going to be a lot of vibrations coming through this thing, and the last thing you want is your motor to come loose and come flying out of the cart while you're doing 30 miles an hour. So make sure you put that blue Loctite on there and let it set for 24 hours. That's the biggest thing. You can't ride this thing for 24 hours. Technically, you can. I'm not going to say you can't, but that blue Loctite is probably not going to set, and you might, break the integrity of that stuff. The next thing you want to install is your sprocket, and this is technically not a D-shaped sprocket, but it works for D-shafted motors. So there's 2 hex screws, and those screws lock the sprocket in place. You're going to want to blue Loctite the living shit out of those. That way your sprocket doesn't come loose. Next thing is line the chain up. So you're going to have to cut a new chain and make sure this chain has a master link. That way you can adjust it. So go ahead and put your chain on the motor, and then you can install it into the frame here. Again, this makes everything really easy using the prefab mount because it has a adjustable slider, so that way if your sprocket is slightly off, you can slide the motor mount left and right to get the proper sprocket alignment. So fast forwarding a little bit, I have connected the phase wires to my controller. This is pretty straightforward. You just want to do left to left, right to right, and middle to middle. And then you're going to want to install your switch that came with the Flipsky. That goes where the charging port went. And to mount the controller, you can just use some foam and zip ties and mount it like you see here. To do the throttle for the Crazy Cart, you're going to use the 3 wires. So you're going to use the top 3 wires that come on the Crazy Cart, and you're going to wire that to the 3.3 volt, the ground, and the ADC1 input on your Flipsky. I'll have a wiring diagram in the description below that you can look at. That way you can see how everything's done on paper. You're going to want to make sure that your motor wires are not pinched or in the way of the swiveling action for drifting. And once that's all set up, you can now move into the VSC. Alright guys, so now we're going to go over the Vesc tool, how to set up your brushless Crazy Cart for the first time. So now that you have everything installed, your throttle's installed, your motor's installed, your controller's installed, it's all plugged in. What you want to do is now turn it on. So go ahead and plug the battery in, power it up, hit the switch. Then you're going to want to download the Vesc tool app on your phone. This is going to be the Bluetooth app that connects to the controller. This is how you set everything up. So you need this app. It's $3 or $4, something like that. Once you open the app, you should see your Vesc pop up on there, and then you can just click connect. And so I'm gonna I forgot to start screen recording, so you're gonna click connect on there. It's gonna say, hey, warning, this Vesc has old firmware, but it's mostly compatible. Just hit OK. You don't need to upgrade the firmware out of the box. It should work fine. I believe every time I've done this, it's worked fine. I've never updated the firmware. The next thing is you're gonna make sure your cart's front wheel is off the ground, because we're gonna run the motor detection. So the first thing you're gonna do once you're in the app is hit set up motors. Once you hit set up motors, it's gonna ask you to load the default parameters. We're gonna say, no, we don't wanna load the default parameters. You're then gonna hit the type of motor it is, or the usage of this motor. So it's just gonna be a generic motor, and we're gonna hit next. For this specific type of motor, it's a large outrunner. So this is the Flipsky 7070, large outrunner. Hit next. It's gonna say, hey, the motor selection determines the maximum current for your motor. We're gonna hit OK, that's fine. Then it's going to ask us about the battery that we're using. So you can do a lithium ion or whatever type of battery you got. I'm using a lead acid, so we're going to hit lead acid. This is a 13S battery, and it has a 5 milliamp hour capacity, or a 5 amp hour capacity, so that's fine, we can leave that. So then they're going to ask us about our battery regen, so we can select that little box. Battery current regen, we can do 5 amps, and battery current max, this is 30 amps. This will be different depending on what type of battery you have, but these are safe numbers for a majority of the batteries out there. So a 5 amp regen and a 30 amp max current. Go ahead and hit next. Here it's going to ask you about your gearing ratio, so we're going to do a 15 pole. So I have a 15 sprocket on the top and a 55 sprocket on the lower. So we're going to go ahead and input those numbers. It's then going to ask us our wheel diameter. I have a 200 millimeter wheel, so that's in there it's already in there. If it's not in there, just go ahead and change that to 200 millimeters. As long as you're doing this for a crazy cart, that's what actually determines your miles per hour. So if that's not correct, your miles per hour won't work in the app. It's going to ask you your motor poles. As long as it says 14 for the Flipsky 7070, that's correct, so we'll just leave it as 14. So then I'm going to ask you the temperature sensor type. As long as that one there says NTC 10K at 25C, it's good. You can just then hit run detection. And at this point, you really want to make sure that your front wheel is not hitting the ground and can spin freely, because you'll see that it'll actually start to spin the motor for us. So hit run detection. It's going to say detect all motors over CAN bus, detect FOC parameters. This is going to spin up all motors, make sure that nothing's in the way. Hit OK, and you'll see here it'll say processing on your phone. You'll hear a little bit of a sound. It's going to run its detection. It's going to spin the wheel forward and backward. See, all right. So you'll get some detection results after that's all said and done. I want to make sure y'all can still see me. Yep. Yeah, so you'll get some detection results after that. As long as it says success, you can hit OK. Then it's going to ask you to check the wheel direction. So what you'll do is you'll hit forward. As long as the wheel is spinning the direction you want, you can hit finish. If it's not, you can select the inverted little slider there, and then you can recheck your motor direction. Sometimes you'll need to invert it. In my case, it is inverted for it to spin forward. Sometimes you won't need to. Go ahead and hit finish. Now the motor is pretty much on its basic setup, its stock configuration. You could technically run it in this stock configuration, but what we're going to do is further set it up. So before you can actually ride, I'm just, sorry, checking, make sure the GoPro is still recording. Before you can actually ride, you're going to want to hit set up input, and this will set up your throttle. So there's a little tab that you'll click, hit set up input, it'll say this Vesc, and then you're going to click next. It's just going to make sure that you're connecting to this one. So in this tab here, the type, you're going to want to do ADC input. And then at this point, you're going to want to push the throttle all the way down and release it a couple of times. And then you'll see your value. So it's that first set of numbers, it's VAL. So you'll see when it's fully depressed, it's 8.4. And when it's fully depressed, it's 0.2. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to hold it around 4.2. And once we get to 4.2, we're going to want to hit apply and write, and then you'll notice when you go to press full throttle, you'll get either 1 or 0.99, as close to 1 as possible. And yeah, that's what you want. And then you can click next. It's going to ask you for the controller type. Just keep it as current. We're going to want to use that filter and safe start as regular. Right configuration, next. Now your throttle works. But we're going to want to do a couple more things. So when you're in this page here, you're going to want to swipe to the left so you see motor config highlighted. And under you'll see two drop down menus at the top. They'll both say general at the start. You're going to want to keep the first one as general, and then you want to go to, on the second drop down menu, you want to go to current. Under current, we're going to want to set the max motor current. This is just a safe number. You can play around with it. This motor can take up to 90 amps. So we're going to set ours at 65 comfortably. That way we don't overamp the motor and it doesn't overheat. Each time you input a number, there's a little glitch in the app. You have to hit help to get out of that screen, and then just hit right configuration. The next one, motor current max brake. If you want a lot of motor braking, you can up this number. Don't go above your motor current max though. So if your motor current max is set to 65 amps, you should really never exceed that number. So I don't like a lot of motor braking, so I'm going to set that to 5 amps, negative 5 amps. Your absolute maximum current, you're going to want to set that to about 2 to 3 times your motor current max. That way you don't have any situations where you're going up a hill or you're hitting the throttle really hard and your controller cuts out. So 65 times 3 is roughly, let's see. So we can set this to 180 and have that be comfortable. Right, okay. Slow ABS current limit, we're going to leave off. Motors max current scale 100%. You're going to leave all this battery configuration because we did that during the initial motor detection. Just double, it's always good to just click right one more time before you move on. You're going to want to go to the voltage on the second drop down menu, and we're going to set the battery voltage cutoff start. So this is when it's going to start limiting the voltage. That way you don't ruin your battery. So we're going to set this to 40 volts. And then the one below it is your battery voltage cutoff end. So once you reach, let's say 39 volts or 38 volts, your battery will stop delivering, or your controller will stop delivering power to the motor. That way you don't ruin your battery. We're going to write that, and your battery filter constant you can leave at 45. Once you've done the voltage, you can then go down to the RPM. This by stock will say 100,000. Since I've configured this motor before and I didn't reset all the configurations, it says 57,000. This is all based off of the kV value of the motor you chose. So if you have a 110 kV value, like I have here, 110 kV motor like I have, your max ERPM is 57,000 roughly. I think it's a little bit more, but 57,000 is a safe number. So just set that to 57,000 if you have a 110 kV motor. If you have a higher kV motor, there's a math equation, or you could just have ChatGPT figure it out for you. So I'll leave the math equation in the description below, that way you can at least look at it. So once you have the RPM set up, we're then going to go to the wattage. And so for this specific motor, its peak watt rate, its maximum watt rating, whatever you want to call it, is 4,000 watts. We don't really want to always be maxing this motor out, so I set it to 1,800 watts. That seems to be a really good number. It gets you a lot of speed. You could probably comfortably put that around 2,500 to 3,000 watts. I haven't done 3,000 watts and I haven't done 2,500 watts. So I don't know what that'll do to the motor. 1,800 watts gets you up to like 35 miles an hour. So that's pretty freaking fast. So once you have that, just hit right. So 1,800 watts, maximum wattage, maximum braking wattage, 1,800 watts. We'll never use that, but it's there. And so yeah, so once that's all set up, the general tab is done. And then the last thing we're gonna do is our FOC. And so under FOC, you're gonna want to go to something called field weakening. And under field weakening current max, go ahead and set that to 50 amps. That's gonna get you an extra 10 to 15 miles an hour out of your cart. You could actually play around with that. You could do more. I haven't done more, I've done less. It just slows you down when you do less. Basically what field weakening does is it increases your top end and lowers your torque. So we're gonna set that field weakening current max to 50 and leave everything else the same. Hit right. And now you are ready to absolutely shred the streets. This thing is tuned, ready to roll. And so let's see what the mile per hour is in the app. So in the app, it's showing 45 miles an hour. Realistically, you're probably only going to get 35 miles an hour because of the additional weight added to it. If you play around with those amp settings and the wattage settings, you could definitely get more out of this setup. But for now, you're ready to ride and have fun without any worry of blowing your setup up. So yeah, go have fun, guys. I'll catch you in the next one. Hope this video helped. Peace.